Hello, everyone, and welcome to Uncivil Law. For today's case, we have a situation with a customs officer who decided to enrich himself. This is the case of Salvatore Picardi versus the United States of America. In this case, Mr. Picardi was a Customs and Border Patrol officer. He found someone who had money in their suitcase. He decided to take the money and put it into his own pocket. And that's a no-no. If we're going to do civil asset forfeiture, it's the government's money, not your money. Only the government gets to steal your money, but he stole it personally. So we're going to talk about whether or not he can be disciplined in any way as a result of this. So let's get started with this. Picardi was a United States Customs and Border Protection officer working in the international terminal of O'Hare International Airport in Chicago. His assignment there was to screen passengers arriving from locations outside the country prior to their entry into the United States. On February 26, 2016, he was working in this capacity when he decided to steal money from a traveler who had been referred to him for a secondary inspection. A customs officer named Federico Angula was interviewing Miss Chen, a Chinese woman who spoke no English, when Picardi volunteered to help with the inspection. Good of him. Within moments of intervening, Picardi asked how much money Miss Chen was carrying, demanded seeing the money, learned she was carrying $5,000 on $100 bills, which I believe is below the reporting requirement, actually, because I think it's $10,000, but it's been a while since I checked, and then took her purse and suitcase for a search while Officer Angulo and an interpreter interviewed Miss Chen. Instead of searching the bags in view of a security camera, Picardi placed them behind a desk that blocked the camera, removed the money, and hid it on his person. Nice guy. After Officer Angelo cleared Miss Chen to enter the country, he directed her to wait in the hallway with her belongings as he completed the necessary paperwork. Miss Chen soon discovered that the money was no longer in her purse. How could that be? A frantic search began. The interpreter's supervisor, Officer Angelo, another CBP officer, and the supervisor all participated in the search, as did Picardi. When none of the searchers found anything in Miss Chen's belongings or in the room in which the interview had taken place, the supervisor conducted a body search of Miss Chen. At that point, a watch commander was enlisted to review security camera footage of the interview room. While that review was taking place, the bags were moved to another room, and the officers and interpreters continued the search through the belongings. Picardi paced in and out of the new search area 6 times. After the 6th entry and exit, he picked up an item in Miss Chen's clothing, turned it away from the security camera, and shoved the money into the clothing. He then tried to convince several people who had searched the very item of clothing multiple times the money had been there all along. Yes, although you had searched this clothing multiple times, this money was totally there the entire time. Okay, sounds plausible. He claimed it had fallen into the lining of the clothing through a hole in a pocket, and then used a knife to cut the lining to support his story. Facing an incredulous group, he then tried to cast blame on Miss Chen, suggesting she was trying to scam them in order to get more money. Nice. The video evidence, of course, pointed to Picardi as the only person to have access to the money when it disappeared. Picardi was charged with embezzlement by an officer or employee of the United States in violation of law. Embezzling is bad. That is bad. He remained free on bond pending trial. After a jury found him guilty, his bond was modified to require home confinement, which is certainly reasonable. While out on bond, Picardi harassed his estranged wife using electronic and other means. Just a great guy. In addition to his own harassing actions, he engaged a private detective in his efforts to intimidate his wife. Why? Falsely telling the man that he was a customs officer conducting a legitimate investigation, which makes you wonder why he was hiring a private detective, right? If he's a customs officer conducting a legitimate police investigation, guess who would normally do that? The police, one of his other officers. Why would he be enlisting a private officer? Now, I'm not saying it can't happen, but it's a little suspicious, yes. After Picardi was convicted, he enlisted a friend to approach Miss Chen's adult daughter to persuade her to convince her mother to recant her testimony. Witness intimidation. That's great too. Miss Chen's daughter instead contacted law enforcement. Ha 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 ha. Because of this conduct, the court revoked his bond 3 months before sentencing hearing and was taken into custody. This is just an all-round great guy. The pre-sentencing investigation report was prepared approximately 1 year prior to the sentencing hearing. That is a long time. Before some of the conduct that led to the bond revocation came to light. That's a long time before sentencing. 1 year. Okay. The report calculated a base offense level of 6 and recommended a 2-level enhancement for abuse of trust under the sentencing guideline for a total of 8. He's in a position of trust, so he gets an additional enhancement on his charges. With a criminal history category of 1, which is to say he has no criminal history, which makes sense because he's a police officer and has had a background check, so of course he'd be category 1. Otherwise, that'd be really weird. The calculation resulted in a guidelines range of 0 to 6 months imprisonment. Lucky you, I guess. And a fine of between $2,000 and $20,000. The probation officer also submitted a sentencing recommendation, which, like the sentencing report, had been drafted a year before the sentencing hearing. The probation officer advocated a prison term at the high end of the range and a fine of $100,000. So we're going to hurt this guy in his wallet, which I suppose is as valid a way to hurt him as anywhere else. So, like, the normal guidelines call for a fine between $2,000 and $20,000. But the probation office suggested, how about a fine of $100,000? That should get his attention. And they say he can afford it. I mean, probation officer, CBP officers don't make that much money. So I don't know where he had $100,000 in cash to pay, but Lord, oh Lord, okay. The government proposed 2 2-point enhancements. That would be 4, right? 1 for a vulnerable victim under the guidelines. This victim is particularly vulnerable. Makes sense because you're in a position of power. And 1 for obstruction of justice under the guidelines, which makes sense because you were lying to police officers. So that's obstruction. The court recommended vulnerable victim enhancement, but agreed the 2-point obstruction was appropriate because of Bacardi's use of a friend to attempt to influence a witness prior to recanting. That resulted in a offense level of 10, which carried a revised range of 6 to 12 months imprisonment and a fine of $4,000 to $40,000. So again, under the federal law and many state laws, there's like the range of what you can be convicted to and what the guidelines suggest. And the guidelines are suggestions. They are suggestions. They used to be mandatory, but they're suggestions now. And so it looks at your prior criminal history, how many bad things you've done in the past, and how bad this thing is, and puts you in a box grid. And so it's like, okay, you're category 1 prior offenses because you never committed a crime before. But we're trying to figure out where on this guideline you are. So we're going to up you to category 10. So that is now carrying additional time. It's within the statutory range, but you're getting additional more than you would have. Okay. The government argued for a prison sentence within the guideline range of 6 to 12 months, mentioning several aggravating factors and a few mitigating factors, which I'm not sure what those mitigating factors are exactly, presumably his many years of qualified service, but whatever. The government argued no argument regarding the fine. Defense counsel emphasized how much Bacardi had already suffered for his actions. Tell me more, defense counsel. How did Bacardi already suffer? He felt terrible guilt over the death of his father from a stroke that he suffered after Bacardi was charged with the crime. Bacardi's wife divorced him after he commenced the offense and was unable to return to any job in law enforcement with a felony conviction on his record. Yes, I would imagine that finding a police enforcement job with a felony would be somewhat challenging, although there probably are police departments that would hire you. Defense counsel also advised the court that the conviction might result in Bacardi losing his real estate license. Probably. I'd imagine that felony conviction would probably result in you losing your real estate license because, again, that probably requires some modicum of trust and trustworthiness, yes. Counsel also noted mitigating factors, including his participation in mental health treatment and his commitment to ceasing harassment towards his ex-wife. I'm not sure how much credit you should get for committing to ceasing harassment when you weren't, allowed to harass in the first place. I mean, if it were something you were allowed to do and you ceased, then that'd be okay. But I'm not sure you should get bonus points for ceasing harassing when, that is just what you're supposed to do, normally. But the crux of counsel's argument was how much Bacardi had suffered in prison during the 3 months following the revocation of the bond. The 3 months in prison had been really, really hard. Noting that he knew what government had asked for in terms of sentencing, what probation department recommended, counsel asked the court to limit the sentence to time served, arguing Bacardi had experienced significant difficulties in prison. I don't know a ton about prison, but, it's not really intended to be a wonderful, lovely place. And so he's experiencing difficulty in prison. That is one of the reasons that we have prison. This theory of punishment is called general deterrence. We're punishing people to deter people in general from committing crimes. So, the reason prisons are terrible, at least in part, is to prevent you from committing crimes, which apparently didn't work. So now we're just going to punish you. But it's prison is terrible. It's yeah, but, you could have taken note of that and not committed the crime in advance. That would have been super helpful. Bacardi became hypervigilant, and counsel described him as terrified. I'd probably be terrified if I were in prison too. Please don't send me to prison. I'm a nice black leaf. His lawyer continued, and I think the 90 days he's been in jail, he's experienced anything that would rival any of the deeper recesses of Dante's hell. Really? 90 days in jail? Dante's hell? Jeez, that's a little excessive. I don't think prisons are that bad. Okay. I ask your honor to please cut short the abject terror of his life circumstances and say, while clearly would be appropriate, what would be sufficient but not greater than necessary. Well, his lawyers really are advocating that jails are really, really bad, which again is a reason not to commit crimes in the first place, but okay. Finally, counsel urged the court to consider imposing a fine rather than adding time in prison. And if there is a balancing consideration, to please strongly consider answering the question of what is sufficient with response to the time that's already served as punishment enough. There are other ways to punish an individual. That's fair enough. Jail is not the only way to punish someone. Hitting someone in their wallet can be quite effective too. This is a crime of taking someone else's money. A response in addition to custody that has been served is one that has been recommended by the probation department, which is a fine. Money this man can make honestly, legitimately in his whole life. His freedom and liberty has caused him to dwindle away physically and emotionally to the point where I fear for him. Not because I hope your honor will give him a light sentence, but because I truly do. I ask your honor to consider that. So he wants to pay with money, not with time. Which, I suppose, depending on your point of view, equally can be valuable. I mean, $100,000 is a lot of money. So, whether or not that's a just outcome, I'll leave to someone else's determination, but it's at least a reasonable argument, I guess. After hearing Picardi's allocution, which is basically where you confess to everything you did, the court first determined that the probation's recommendation of 3 years of supervised release was appropriate, and the court set conditions for the period of release. The court then announced its decision as to the fine. All right, I'm going to impose a fine, the recommended fine of $100,000. The defendant has the ability to pay it, and also a special assessment of $100. I don't know anything about the special assessment, but that is just adding insult to injury. I'm going to fine you $100,000, but I'm also tacking on a special assessment of $100. So I hope you learn your lesson. Okay. Given the fact there is a fine, it should be paid during the period of the supervised release. So he has 3 years to pay it back. The court next turned to the issue of custody. The court found an extensive list of aggravating factors and rejected much of the argument that Picardi had already suffered enough, finding much of loss and pain to be self-inflicted. Yeah, a lot of this prison is bad stuff. It's bad because you put yourself in prison. You're the one who put yourself there, so you can't really complain. Citing the airport security video, the court deemed Picardi's conduct callous and greedy, as well as calculating rather than impulsive, and described defense counsel and desperate, as defense counsel had argued. Moreover, Picardi was acting as a law enforcement officer at the time. Also, it sounds like he didn't really need this money, right? I mean, just by way of aside, the court's saying he has the ability to pay $100,000, which I'm not sure where he's getting this money from, but apparently he does. So it's not like he apparently needed the $5,000. Apparently he has $100,000 to pay this fine. So apparently he didn't need the $5,000, but he took it anyway. So whatever. Moreover, Picardi was acting as a law enforcement officer at the time he committed his crime, tarnishing the integrity of an important federal agency. He took advantage of an elderly Chinese woman who did not speak English, hoping she would not discover the theft until she had left the airport. He caused her to undergo a body search, knowing the money was in his own pocket. And he attempted to deflect responsibility from himself by casting blame on the victim. Always a popular tactic. The courts love it when you try that, yeah. The court noted that this was not a paper crime, but instead involved a real victim who had endured significant stress. There is, in fact, a real victim. The court remarked on Picardi's failure to apologize to the victim during his allocation in court. So he didn't even say he was sorry as he was listing out what he did. Wow. The court rejected the suggestion that time served was sufficient and sentenced Picardi to 8 months imprisonment, a term within the guidelines range, as recalculated for the attempt as obstruction of justice and Picardi appeals. So I'm assuming that's 8 months total, not 8 months additional. But, hey, that's 5 more months in prison. So you said, just fine me, and the court says, I'm going to fine you and give you prison time. So you're going to serve 8 months in prison, and we're going to pay $100,000. But don't forget that $100 special assessment. That's really to show you what we think of you. That $100 is the most important thing of all. Law can be a little weird sometimes on these things. On appeal, Picardi challenges only the fine imposed. He faults the district court for failing to make specific findings under the guidelines and the rules in order to explain why the above guidelines fine was imposed. He characterizes the failure to adequately explain the fine as a procedural error. He's very, very sad that he has to pay this money. And he says, the court didn't find the things they need to find in order to make me pay. Because the guidelines, as we read, were $4,000 to $40,000. So $100,000 is more than that. He's saying, well, you didn't do the work necessary to prove it. Okay, let's see how that works out for him. We must first consider whether Picardi forfeited or waived the argument he now makes on appeal. Whereas forfeiture is the failure to make the time assertion of a right, waiver is intentional relinquishment, or abandonment of a known right. So there's a minor separation in the law between forfeiture and abandonment, right? Did you forfeit the argument or did you abandon the argument? If you forfeit the argument, it's because you didn't raise the issue, so you forfeited it. If you abandon the argument, you made a conscious decision to abandon. Abandonment requires intent. So it's like I made an active choice. So forfeiture is I dropped the ball. Abandonment is I chose to drop the ball. And the court treats them differently. Fair enough. In this case, the strategic decision is obvious on the face of the record, and Picardi has waived his objections both as to the amount of fine and as to the adequacy of explanation. We begin by noting that Picardi and his lawyer affirmed at the sentencing hearing that they had read and discussed the probation officer's sentencing recommendation. That document included the proposed $100,000 fine, a recommendation made at the time when the maximum guidelines fine had been calculated to $20,000. That maximum was later adjusted to $40,000 at the sentencing hearing. Picardi does not assert that the court miscalculated the correct guideline range. Moments before making the case a sentence for time served, counsel affirmed that he knew what was in the probation report that he recommended. In the context of a sentencing recommendation for custody at the high end of the guideline and a $100,000 fine, Picardi's counsel made an extensive plea for sentence of time served because of the extreme difficulties that Picardi had encountered in 3 months of prison. Don't commit crimes and you won't go to jail and you won't suffer those consequences. It's a good thing. Aware that clearly more time would be appropriate and the court might not accede to the request for time served, counsel offered the court a balancing consideration. Specifically, the counsel argued that time served was punishment enough and there are other ways to punish the individual. This was not simply an inadvertent failure to object to the imposition of an above guidelines fine. It was a calculated strategic decision. Counsel was aware of many aggravating factors present in the case. Before pitching his balancing consideration argument, counsel had twice indicated he was aware of the probation department's sentencing recommendation, which of course included the proposed fine. He then referenced a third time to the recommendation by suggesting that the court impose that fine in lieu of additional time. Those 3 references to the probation department's recommendation without any accompanying objection to the above fine would have led any judge to believe counsel knew the amount and no problem with the recommendation of the fine. The failure to fly the amount of the recommendation fine as an issue was clearly the result of a strategic decision made in the hope it would work to his client's benefit on the custody determination. So, you made a strategic decision. It's like, I'm not going to argue one thing in order to try to make the other thing look better. So it's like, okay, I'm not going to argue the fine in the hopes that, by conceding that ground, the court will go easy on me somewhere else. Now, I don't necessarily fault this strategic decision. It's a perfectly reasonable strategic decision. It's like, you don't want to contest everything because the court already a little bit hates you because, you've been convicted and you've done all these horrible things. So the court already a little bit hates you because you've been convicted. And so one of the things you might do is you might want to try to say, well, is there any ground I can give to try to give somewhere so I can get somewhere else, right? So it would probably be a bad idea to argue, oh, my fine should be reduced and I should get less time. That comes with consequences. But, to say, okay, I'm going to say, give me the maximum fine, but show mercy on me on time, seems like a perfectly reasonable decision. The fact it didn't turn out that way for you doesn't mean it was a bad strategic call. I'm not even saying I disagree that it was a bad strategic call. It may have been a strategic call that I would have agreed to too, but it didn't come out that way in the end. You just because you have good strategy doesn't mean you're going to win. So, that's what happened here. The defendant here waived any objection to the fine and led the court to believe there's no reason to further explain his decision. The waiver extinguishes any claim of error, precluding appellate review, and the appeal is therefore dismissed. So that is the end of our discussion of United States of America versus Salvatore Picardi. In this case, Mr. Picardi was a customs officer. and he found an elderly Chinese woman who did not speak English with $5,000 in her purse as she went through customs. He decided to take the money and put it into his own pocket. And then they found the money, and, he got arrested and charged with a whole bunch of things. And he was being threatened with both jail time and a very large fine, $100,000 fine. And he's, as part of a strategic decision, said, well, I'll agree to pay the fine in the hope I get less jail time. But the court said, no, we're going to give you jail time and pay the fine. So pay us $100,000 of fine and go to jail for another 5 months. And he's sad because, he was offering to pay the fine in the hope of avoiding jail time. But it's not a contract. It's not an offer acceptance kind of thing. The court can do anything within the range. So all you're doing at that point is begging for mercy. So the court decided not to take your offer, but you don't get to withdraw your offer like a contract. You were offering a gift, and the government just basically said, no, we're not interested in that. We're just going to take it, and we're going to send you to jail. He's sad that he's both poor and has to spend another 5 months in jail. But, if you had not, defrauded and taken this money off this elderly Chinese woman, then, you wouldn't have these consequences, and you'd still be married, and you'd still live in your house, and you'd be $100,000 richer, and you wouldn't be in jail, and you would have been able to be a police officer somewhere else. So that is the end of our coverage of that case. Thank you for joining me as we both read this case together and now better understand the law. If you're enjoying this legal education content, please subscribe to this channel. It really helps us grow. And check out one of our other videos, including the one that's currently being displayed on the thumbnail on screen. Thank you so much for your continued support. And until later, my friends, cheers and goodbye.